Today's conversation is a precursor to something little more ambitious we hope to develop down the road, bringing together these three countries and perhaps another country or two. Now, apart from Vani, as you can see, we have with us two former Indian ambassadors to Afghanistan, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya and Ambassador Amar Sinha, who have closely followed what's happening in Afghanistan, a country of great interest to us due to a variety of reasons. And from Chinese side, we have three colleagues belonging to two of the leading think tanks of China, KIKIR and CIIS. From KIKIR, we have Dr. Wang and also Mr. Yiming, and from CIS we have Ms. Qingyan. So as you can see, we have a strong panel consisting of academics and practitioners. Now we hope to have fairly free-flowing discussion, so we don't have any rigidly defined agenda for this conversation. But broadly, we hope to discuss the current situation in Afghanistan in terms of various political, security and economic challenges, including parliamentary elections which just took place on the 20th of this month. We will review some recent developments in the peace and reconciliation process, including contacts made by U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad with Taliban on 12th of this month, and what happened subsequently, attack by Taliban related forces in Kandahar, which targeted in fact the US and NATO army commander in Afghanistan and led to killing of a senior police chief Kandahar and a parliamentary election candidate. We'll also know.
To have to speak at this meeting in Delhi. I recall my first research trip to India was in 1974 in the summer, which I spent in Jaipur, and I was actually doing research on the Sikh Andolan, which I'm sure none of you have heard of, but it was an uprising by the Thakur of Sikh against the Maharaja in the late 1930s, and it had some interesting political aspects. But for me, the most memorable part of that is I learned there was a very important sentence in Hindi that I heard on All India Radio, which has always stuck with me, which was, America ke Rashtrapati Richard Nixon ne apna tyag patra de diya. And I just thought in recent days, maybe this sentence will become relevant again. But to get to our topic, Afghanistan has been at war for 40 years. I want to take a somewhat broader view of it and a broader view of the peace process. And we discussed this beforehand. I think we're all similarly minded about it. Because certainly there is a domestic aspect to the Afghan peace process, but given the nature of Afghan state and society, it doesn't matter what Afghans agree on if they cannot pay for it. And they cannot pay for it unless they have international support. And that's by design, because the state of Afghanistan as it now exists is the result of agreements between the British and Russian empires. And it was demarcated precisely so it would be dependent on the British Empire. And since that time, it has never been able to go through any period of stability without having some kind of external subsidy to pay for the government, and particularly to pay for the army. Now, the British and Russians, as I'm sure all of you know, not only agreed that it would be under British suzerainty, but they also demarcated areas of influence and so on in the entire region, in Iran, in Central Asia, in Tibet, and so on. And that meant that the fact that even though the British were supporting the army, the Russians did not take it as a threat because the British themselves kept out of it. Now, that agreement, little by little, it disintegrated and declined as Russian Revolution, decolonization, partition, and so on. Finally, it completely collapsed with the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979, because finally, once again, a foreign army entered Afghanistan. And instead of there being a balance, the Afghan state was dependent on the support from one side in the Cold War. And the strategic context there was the Cold War. So therefore, the fact that from the Soviet Union's point of view, I believe, they saw themselves as going into Afghanistan in order to stabilize a country on their borders that was posing a kind of threat to them. But the fact that they stabilized it by creating a government that was dependent on them in the context of the Cold War meant that much of the rest of the world, led by the United States and also much of the Islamic world, took it as a threat and therefore supported the resistance to them. So there was no Soviet-supported stabilization of Afghanistan. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and Afghanistan lost strategic value for all great powers, and as a result you had a civil war and virtually no state. Pakistan briefly succeeded in putting the Taliban in power, or assisting the Taliban to take power in most of Afghanistan. But then a new threat arose, the threat of international terrorism, which once again gave Afghanistan strategic significance that led to the intervention led by the United States. Now, initially there was a great deal of consensus internationally about this. In fact, a consensus by almost all countries except for Pakistan, which was somewhat outside that, consensus, because the United States cooperated with Russia and Iran and Central Asia and so on in setting up the government. And I witnessed the cooperation, I participated in the cooperation between the United States and Iran myself at the Bonn conference. But that began to fray. I think we were discussing this earlier. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, I forget what date you gave for when the consensus began to fray, but I would say the first signs that I saw were in 2005, when the United States and Afghanistan issued a declaration of strategic partnership. And the heads of state of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization responded by saying that it was time for the anti-terrorist coalition to leave Central Asia. Because they understood that, and I think this was very poorly understood in the United States at the time, and maybe not in Afghanistan, they understood that as saying that the United States would have a permanent presence in Afghanistan to establish itself strategically on the Asian continent for the first time, which would be a major strategic change and a challenge to those countries. That was reinforced by the bilateral security agreement, which was signed by President Ashraf Ghani's government after he took power after he was inaugurated in 2014. There have been ups and downs along the way, but the result of that is that some of the countries in the region now believe that the United States is not there to fight terrorism, but to establish a strategic hold in the area. And of course, the more the United States has bilateral opposition to those countries, the more they feel threatened by it. And the fact is, given that Afghanistan is, and this is something people don't pay enough attention to in my view, it is the poorest country in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa. It's by far the poorest country in Asia. And yet it's surrounded by 4 nuclear powers, plus Iran, which has nuclear capabilities, and 2 of the largest economies of the world, China and India, plus the United States is present there. So the strategic stakes around Afghanistan have grown tremendously since the United States went in. And yet the consensus under which it originally went in has frayed. So in addition, obviously, the United States is a bit tired after 17 years. It's far, and people don't see the point of continuing something that doesn't seem to be succeeding. Which means a peace process, which is also to stabilize Afghanistan, not only does it need a domestic consensus, but it needs to build a modern form of the agreement between Britain and Russia, which will no longer be among empires, Central Asia all the way to Europe. I mean, China is now defining. It now has a more like a great power idea of its interest in terms of continental stability. And very interestingly, as you know, after Wuhan, not after Wuhan, because Ambassador Mukhopadhaya said even, was it you? During the time, no, you were saying when you were ambassador in China, there were some tentative ideas about China-India cooperation. And now a program just started last week, I believe, of cooperative training of diplomats, which is similar to or identical to a program that the United States and China did together. And there's discussion about China and India cooperating on some, in the future, not immediately, on major infrastructure projects, such as building a railroad from Uzbekistan through northern Afghanistan and into Iran down to the port of Chabahar. That's a big vision. I'll just end with a kind of a vision statement. We know that today there's all kinds of conflicts among the different states in the region. President Trump's South Asia strategy was kind of predicated on the idea that the United States would work with India to counterbalance Pakistan. He didn't even mention China and Russia and Iran in his original speech. And sometimes one gets the impression that the United States sees some kind of an India-China Cold War in Asia. But I think that the countries that are actually here, as far as I understand, neither India nor China wants to get sucked into that, despite the very real differences between them, and are looking for means of cooperation. And besides all the bigger issues that involves, that is, I think, also the only way that Afghanistan could be stabilized, because you will need not only a consensus on what kind of government to have, but a consensus on how to connect it to the region so that it can become economically more self-sufficient, on how to support this government and the security forces. So this is a very small step in a long process, but I hope it will help us develop some ideas about that, maybe overcome some preconceptions that we have. And I want to thank very warmly the Institute of Chinese Studies for hosting this and making this possible.
Thank you, Professor Rubin, for those introductory remarks. As you can see, a lot of interest in Afghanistan and possibility of collaboration among the three countries, India, China, and USA. We are adding a lot of chairs here to accommodate this additional audience. So Gautam, can we now move on to you? Yeah.
Thank you, Ashok. Let me also begin by firstly thanking Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Ashok. Let me also begin by thanking the Institute for China Studies, as well as Professor Barnett, Rubin, and his institution, and our Chinese colleagues represented here, for this opportunity to have a public panel discussion on Afghanistan, and in particular the possibility of international cooperation involving both China, India, and also the US on Afghanistan. Just a couple of demerits before I start. I think while we are discussing this issue amongst ourselves, we mustn't forget that Afghanistan is an absent presence, and definitely Afghanistan should be center and front, and also that its voice must be part of such dialogues perhaps in the future, so that the feeling is not there that somehow they are excluded in discussions on Afghanistan. And of course, the fact is...
We have a colleague from Afghanistan.
Oh, very well. I'm glad to have that. And second, that of course I'll be speaking in a personal capacity. As a former ambassador, I hope I'll be not too far from a generally Indian point of view. But so I'd come with actually a few prepared points to raise for this occasion. The first is on the issue of security. I think very clearly what we have seen is a severe deterioration in the security situation. There are reports that, or assessments, that about more than 50% of Afghanistan is under insurgent control or Taliban control. Not quite sure where those statistics come from, because in fact no major provincial capital and very few even district capitals could be said to be actually under the Taliban. But anyway, that's the impression, that about 60% is, of 50 to 60% is outside government control. But I think 2-3 points that I would like to make on that. One is that despite all the challenges, the security forces have held, and their performance when it has come to crisis situations, whether it has been major terrorist attacks which have required the intervention of special forces, or it has been the attacks on major towns like Kunduz and Ghazni, the security forces have in general always prevailed. And in spite of the huge attrition, casualties and losses that the security forces have suffered, somehow morale has also not subsided. And I think this was actually witnessed during the recent parliamentary poll when, despite Taliban threats and attempts, on the whole, security was ensured. Another important point here is that it's very ironic in a way that the security of Afghanistan today is being mentored by powers that by and large have not been known for their success in subduing Afghanistan in the past. And the techniques of war that are being used are also probably very far from Afghan techniques. And in the Afghan context of war, in fact, it has been indigenous tactics and techniques that have traditionally succeeded, whether it was Masood in the past, or for that matter, General Razik in the present. And NATO standards and costs and the equipments that, and the standards and costs that come with them are actually far higher than what armies in the subcontinent and South Asia, including India, Pakistan and Iran, can normally afford. By one assessment, it costs the US about 6 times more to train an Afghan soldier than it would cost an Indian or Pakistani soldier to be trained in India. So the reason I say this is because there is the security threat that in a way emanates from, I would not say Afghanistan as much as Pakistan, is something that we all share and we all feel, and all the neighboring countries of Afghanistan also feel. And China, as Barney said, as a recent entrant, could also have a common interest to cooperate in the stability and security of Afghanistan, not necessarily together with India, but they can be parallel efforts that contribute to the same effort. The second point is on the political situation. By the way, I would like to first congratulate also Barney for that excellent tour de horizon that he gave us on the international context of the current situation in Afghanistan. But talking about the post-Bonn consensus, the post-Bonn consensus was built on a particular ethnic balance between the Pashtuns and the non-Pashtuns. To a certain extent, that ethnic balance has been revised a little during the period of President Karzai's tenure, but the balance has by and large held. Now, what we are seeing in the current context is that President Ghani, for example, has launched a very welcome, very necessary, and I think very much, in some respects, required reform process. That reform process has included an agenda on corruption and included an agenda against the warlords, but somehow the manifestation that it has taken place has been a little inconsistent. So the perception is that the reform agenda in a way has targeted ethnic leaders and not necessarily targeted ethnic leaders from the Pashtun side. So what we are seeing is the return of Hikmatyar and also the possibility of reconciliation with the Taliban, whose ultimate impact would be in fact a complete revision of the internal post-Bonn consensus, in addition to the external consensus that Barney referred to. And if that were to happen, I think we are still not at that stage. We would know what the reaction of the ethnic areas of Afghanistan would be. So even before we enter the conversation on reconciliation, there is a big requirement for at least some idea of an internal consensus within Afghanistan on what the terms for an Afghan consensus for a reconciliation with the Taliban would be, and what would be the trade-offs. And the second question is whether the Taliban would be agreeable to such a... Now, if we then go back to the whole issue of reconciliation, we'll see that, you know, India has supported an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process, but we have not seen a truly Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process so far. Most of the peace processes that have taken place so far have had a very strong hand of external powers, whether it has been the US or the West on the one hand, or for that matter, Russia on the other. Now, one of the problems with the Taliban has been that so far, negotiations with the Taliban historically, since the time they emerged in Pakistan in the mid-1990s, and that when the US reached out to them to try and understand what they were about, there has never been any agreement If there was any agreement, it has been provisional in nature. It has never been backed by the leadership. Whether the leadership has been independent and autonomous or under the control of Pakistan has never been very clear. Whether the negotiators actually represented and carried powers to negotiate on behalf of the leadership has also not been clear. So this whole idea of talks with the Taliban and reconciliation with the Taliban has been a mirage that has been consistently a mirage that has not yielded fruit at any point. And the second question on that issue is the question of ability to share power. So far we have not seen, we are talking about bringing the Taliban into the power structure in Afghanistan, but we have not seen any clear indication, and I'm sure Barnett may have something more to add to this or to correct this, but we have not seen any indication of their ability to share power. And the third thing is, of course, a much more fundamental contradiction that is not often flagged, is a basic doctrinal contradiction between the idea of an Islamic state that the Taliban at least profess to follow, and the idea of an Islamic republic. And this is not just an obscure doctrinal issue, because it actually takes expression in things like elections. And in the elections, the Taliban had quite clearly declared that they would not support elections, even if it's not support elections, possibly because they are under US occupation, in quotes, as well as a government that they do not recognize, but that the public turnout for a poorly prepared election in which security, at least from the pictures that we saw, were not so well provided, was remarkable. Which means to say, by and large, there is a public support for the idea of Islamic Republic, which was also, of course, first of all endorsed in the 2004 constitution. So where does this notion of Taliban power come from? It entirely comes not even from the battlefield, because there are no major battlefield successes. They only come from Taliban's terrorist activities, mostly sponsored from safe havens outside Afghanistan. And in a sense, capitulation to an untested demand for popularity is a capitulation to pressure tactics shown through violence. The area where I think China and India could, and so on the political consensus too, I feel that so far the United States has played a fairly leading role, particularly in the last. Some of the major players, like the United States, is actually not present. Now, could there be another kind of geometry which could bring the countries most closely involved together to be able to look at joint solutions? So I think these are some of the areas where I think both the challenges are there, as well as the difficulties and the opportunities where China and India can cooperate.
Thank you very much, Gautam, for bringing out both the complexities and challenges, inherent situation, as also the potential for collaboration. Now I'll invite, Dr. Wang Shida. Shida is the Deputy Director of Institute of South and Southeast Asian Oceanic Studies of Qingyan.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, friends in India. You say it's a great pleasure to visit India again. For me, I think it is almost 15 times for me to visit India. But for such kind of oriental great civilization, you never pay too much visit. First, I would like to say the warm hospitality from the ICS. You see that from the perspective of KICA, and the ICS and KICA have been, I think, a partner for, I think, more than dozens of years. So that's another long history. But I also want to thank Professor Rubin, who is my tutor, not only when studying in New York University, but also after that in my research, in my work after 2015. And I would like to share my humble opinions on this kind of topics. I would like to focus two parts. Very simple. The first part is that the common interest among these three countries. Simply put it, why these three countries can cooperate. The second part is that, in my humble opinion, what kind of potential areas that these three countries can explore. The first part is that it is a common interest for these three countries. First and foremost, all these three countries want a peace, stable Afghanistan instead of chaotic Afghanistan. I think very important is that all three countries just do not want a chaotic Afghanistan, so that the terrorism pose a severe threat to regional and international security. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Rubin. From the perspective of US, I think we see the 911 in 2001. I think that is the US perspective. From the perspective of India, but I think my humble opinion is that definitely peace and stable Afghanistan. So up till in the past several years, I think some terrorist or extremist groups pose some kind of severe threat to the Indian target in and out Afghanistan. So that India also wants a peace and stable Afghanistan. For China, with time going by, I think just now, Ambassador Kantha and also Professor Rubin and also Ambassador Gautam, you also mentioned that in past years, I think the attitudes of Chinese, I speak as Chinese scholars, from my humble observation, the attitude toward Afghanistan really changed, especially after the withdrawal of the United States in 2014. You see, among these three countries, namely China, US, and India, China is only de facto direct neighbor of Afghanistan. But Hershan province, which is in the north east part of Afghanistan, is directly adjacent to the Tashkurgan district, which is a district in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. With this share a common border, it's called Wang corridor. So that China is a direct neighbor. So we all know that in 1990s, ETI, as well as some kind of other extremists, took advantage of Al-Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan. So that ETI, of course, definitely is a severe threat to Afghanistan, to China. And also in recently, past several years, we can see that we have a lot of news, at least reports that ETI, together with some kind of other extremists, are getting more and more active in north part of Afghanistan. North part of Afghanistan means the direct adjacent to Central Asia, as Xinjiang Autonomous Region, so that China's desire for peace in Afghanistan is very clear. The second issue, the second common interest, I think, for the three countries is that all three countries outcomes Afghanistan as a potential place to economic cooperation. We have mentioned several times in different kind of meetings or seminars, either in China or international seminars, that Afghanistan really enjoys such kind of strategic location. It's really called the heart of Asia. It's adjacent to the East Asia to the east, South Asia to the south, South Asia to the south, then Central Asia to the north, while West Asia to the west. It really has the potential to become the land bridge links Eurasia, become the heart of the Eurasia. If Afghanistan had realized the potential of the heart of Asia, definitely the United States is kind of a release, at least a relief for the United States budget, annual budget for Afghanistan. In the future, I think the U.S. would like to see a self-dependent economy, Afghan economy, and a self-reliant Afghan budget, and that is definitely. For India, I think in China we hear a lot of ideas about Indians' potential or ideas or link Russia, Central Asia, through the west part of India and through the Chabahar port. You see that in the past several years, I think the joint exploration of Chabahar port of Iran already, I think, makes some kind of concrete progress. So that is also the potential regional economic cooperation. For China, it's quite clear. My professor Barnett Rubin mentioned that the BNI initiative already, I think, 5 years passed since it first came out in 2013. Under the framework of BNI, at least 6 economic corridors, while Afghanistan just leads in the between of 2 economic corridors, namely CPEC. The other one is China, Central Asia, and West Asia economic corridor. So that if I want to remind that in December 2017, there is kind of first round of Sino, Pakistan, Afghanistan trilateral foreign minister meeting in Peking. During that meeting, I think 3 foreign ministers make agreement that for the potential cooperation, especially economic cooperation among these 3 countries, they also mentioned the potential extension of CPEC to Afghanistan and the potential link CBEC to the China Central Asia and West Asia economic corridor through Afghanistan. So you can see how important of Afghanistan's strategic location. Then come to my second part, that is the potential cooperation area. For me, first, I think maybe we chose some kind of area of low sensitivity, like joint training programs. Just now, I think several scholars already mentioned that after Wuhan, the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi have created the Indian-China Plus cooperation in Afghanistan. Last week, we kicked off the joint training program between China and India towards Afghan diplomats. And China and the US have this kind of similar training programs towards diplomats and health technicians and agriculture technicians in the past several years. I think maybe in the future, this kind of bilateral cooperation, bilateral training program can extend to a trilateral cooperation, not only diplomat, but also some kind of technicians that totally needed in the Afghan economic reconstruction. If at the current stage, if we cannot kick off a trilateral training program now, I think at least we can make some kind of informal arrangement, like the US and India more concentrated on some kind of areas, and China and India more concentrated in other areas, while US and India concentrated in the other area. So that this kind of informal arrangement, I think, might be useful. Other than training program, to me, I think the irrigation project and joint exploitation of mineral resources, as well as other issues, especially medical assistance, this kind of regions all have great potential because these areas are all very important to the Afghans' economic and social reconstruction. The second issue on the potential areas that is a little bit difficult for me, I think, at the current stage, but I think that is the key to the future of Afghan peace and stability. That is the peace process. Just now, we already heard that this year, Mr. Trump really changed his attitude towards the peace process of Afghanistan to allow the high-ranking diplomat to have direct talks with Afghan Taliban in Doha. And they have already, I think, at least 2 rounds of talks, as far as I know. As a Chinese scholar, I think it's very encouraging for a Chinese scholar to see the direct talks between US and Afghan Taliban, because I think in the past several years, China always adhered to the principle that China supported Afghan-led and Afghan-owned reconciliation, and totally believes that the futures of Afghan peace and stability lies in the hand of the Afghan people. But you see, Afghan Taliban always want to have direct talk with the US. Now US say yes, so it's really a good kickoff. But we still see that there are still some different players' position. For example, on the second round of direct talks between US Special Envoy Khalizad and Afghan Taliban's representatives, you'll see Afghan Taliban still want to withdraw of United States US troops from Afghanistan. I think US maybe not yet decided whether to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan. I think that is a different position. Another position is that Mr. Khalizad wants another ceasefire for 6 months. Well, before the parliamentary election, obviously Afghan Taliban said no. Yeah. I think after the 3 days ceasefire in I think September or August, up till now, Afghan Taliban continue to say no to another new round of ceasefire arrangement. Yes. So other than that, I think the countries in the region or out of the regions still have their own interest and own security concerns on the future of Afghanistan. For example, I think in the past several years, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan, I think, they have more and more similar position with time going by. I think while the US and India have more and more similar or even same position on the reconciliation process. So I think the tragedy of Afghanistan, not only for now, but also if we look back a little to the history, the real concrete tragedy of Afghanistan is that all countries in the region or outer region all emphasize the geopolitical interest as well as the anti-terrorism interest. Sometimes the geopolitical interest much more important than anti-terrorism interest. So, in my opinion, I think countries include US, India, and China, as well as other regional countries or countries outside this region, should take, I think, a more open-minded and inclusive attitudes towards reconciliation. I think that is my humble opinion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Wang, Shida, for making some very important points. Dr. Wang highlighted the fact that how India, China, and USA have common stakes, shared interests in terms of ensuring stability of Afghanistan. I think that's the basic, premise, this shared assessment that has led to this conversation, in fact. He has also suggested a number of areas where there can be cooperation bilaterally between India and China, along with Afghanistan, or trilaterally involving India, China, and USA. Kind of burden sharing for capacity building and development also he suggested. Dr. Wang referred to the launching of a training program for Afghan diplomats in New Delhi just a few days ago on 15th, a joint program with China. Now, I would like to recall what Minister of External Affairs, Ms. Sushma Swaraj, said in her remarks while launching this program. She said that this marks the beginning of what we visualize as a long-term trilateral partnership for the benefit of Afghanistan. So it's not meant to be a one-off collaborative project, but clearly, there is understanding that we look at broader, longer-term partnership between India and China along with Afghanistan in a trilateral framework. I'll now request Ambassador Amar Sinha to make his opening remarks.
So I think after 3 opening remarks, I think I'd not give you a tool here on its own. Thank you very much. What I will do is perhaps start the conversation with you. So I will try and be provocative, raise a few questions. And of course, I'm deeply interested in listening to our Chinese colleagues because that is one actor, and I think a very important actor in Afghanistan, which one doesn't know very much about what it wants to do or how it wants Afghanistan to evolve, etc., etc. But just as a background, next year is also Afghanistan's 100 years of independence, 2019. So it will be rather tragic because the reports that we see from Afghanistan in terms of the deepening crisis in security, that the international community just gives up and walks away. That, of course, is the easiest to do. Of course, except for Americans, who can live with a reputation of having being beaten or defeated in Afghanistan. And this will be the second time round, and a second round of victory for Taliban, because they also always boast that they defeated the Soviet Empire. So whether this will strengthen these tendencies of fanaticism and use of terrorism, that is a question that all of us need to reflect upon. So the point here is that Afghanistan needs all our assistance. It needs all the international players to sort of put away their geopolitical and geostrategic interests and competition away and focus on some key issues which would help. And I think the first thing is to have sort of complete commitment to the government in Kabul. Now, of course, I call it a democratic government. It is a flawed process, all right. I think all of us, when we are growing up as democracies, we saw different sort of flaws. It has taken us 70 years to perfect it. Even today, there are doubts raised about times EVMs malfunctioning and that sort of thing in India after 70 years. So, despite all this, the big takeaway that I had was that Afghans have maintained the sovereignty and unity of their country. They want a modern state. They don't want to live under a flag of Islamic Emirate. Huge number, tremendous progress has been done in education, particularly women education. And I think the biggest vote of confidence that they gave to the system was on 20th of October when they turned out to vote. The reports are that 4 million people voted. This is despite killing of Razi, which of course was a huge dent, but was a huge psychological issue in Afghanistan. I'll come to that in a moment. But if you look at the 3,000 odd candidates, there were over 500 women across the country actually competing for the seats in the parliament. And obviously, so women understand in Afghanistan that if they go back to a situation before, as it prevailed before 2001, they'll be the biggest losers. As they have been the biggest gainers today, there are, when I think the largest growth that we have seen is in the women enrollment in education. There are over, I think, 700,000 women today, when the numbers used to be a few hundreds only 15 years ago. We, of course, all of you are aware of what India's stand on Afghanistan is. And I would like to remind our Chinese colleagues that both of us are immediate neighbors. Now, there's an irony in this, that because of the disputed territory of Jammu and Kashmir, we lost that immediate connect, while China became an immediate neighbor of Pakistan. That is something we should not forget about when we talk about. And that is the reason why there is resistance in India on BRI, etc. But on one area where there should be absolute congruence and overlap of interest is the security and threats that emanate from that region. And I don't want to blame any country. I like to call it a region. It's the area between the Indus River and the Amar Darya, which is really the locus of terror. It crosses the Af-Pak border. And we have seen, and we say this to our Chinese colleagues repeatedly, that this is not something that we do just out of propaganda or we want to decry any particular country, but because we have suffered after '89, where during, and especially in the Taliban regime, when the Taliban took over, that Afghanistan became a laboratory for terrorism, and it has continued. The arms were perfected, tactics were perfected, a terrific command and control system was established which had links across the border, and that is something that India is determined will not allow to happen. And I'm sure we'll reach out to all our partners, and I think about the reality as it prevails. Now, how we can operationalize a robust cooperation is something that all of us, and that should include perhaps Pakistan also, should sit together and find out that for the long term, how is it that we engage China. We have made a step in development, sir. This is also about what is the possible areas of cooperation. Of course, first step has been taken, which is the easiest training of diplomats. But the entire rubric of human resource development is something that China can play a major role. India is playing a huge role in terms of the scholarships that we provide, and something like that in terms of both the technical and vocational training and education from China would be a big step. On large mega projects, of course, we know the ability and the sort of competence of China in implementing these projects, but in Afghanistan, because of security, their own project, and our also, which was linked to it, both Mezainak and the Hajikat project did not take off. Basically because one was linked to the other. Mezainak was linked to setting up of railway, and Hajikat was to piggyback ride on this railway line, so both stopped. Now that is something, if we could revive, perhaps look at new alignments. A railway line or a track running out of Bamiyan or central Afghanistan westwards to Iran, and that would run through the entire mineral corridor of Afghanistan, and that will be a game changer. Of course, it will take a lot of money and it will take some time, but that will be a major step. And of course, we would also welcome if this joins up with Peshawar and eventually to the Indian Railway Network. You know, just don't call it BRI. That's just an aside. But please do that. And there are other issues that we can actually, and good in connectivity. The Chabahar, of course, it's both ironic and sad. The Chabahar was the project which the Shah of Iran in 1973 dreamt of. And the main partners who were to implement it were the Americans. The all American companies were lined up to build Chabahar. This was because it's very important for Iran Remember that Iran, this is the only port of Iran that is directly has access to ocean. It's not in the Straits, which was at that point, of course, they were worried about attacks from, because they were fighting these battles. And of course, slightly away from the Sunni heartland of which Iran seems to be particularly scared. 77, the oil shock, I think they ran out of money, it couldn't take off. 79, sanctions came, and of course, the rest is history. We have talked about it for now 15 years. Now, Chabahar, if the way it has been envisaged, that the port and the railway connectivity up north from there will automatically go and end up joining the China-funded project which connects Chinese railways to Uzbekistan, because this railway line will also end up in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. So I think this is a project of huge importance, of course, for India, for Iran, ironically even for the American forces. But they have operated their war in Afghanistan while at the same time having sanctions on Iran, because this was the easiest access and exit route to Afghanistan, and they would not have become, their policies would not have become sort of prisoners of whims and fancies of Pakistan. This Karachi route could have been avoided. In fact, the entire European forces, if you see, were deployed along the western borders. And easiest exit was Chabahar, but unfortunately, that even non-combat equipment could not be taken out. Of course, I kept talking about it, but this was an idea before they removed the sanctions, and now we are looking at sanctions again. So these are 2 or 3 major things, but the other small thing that we can work together are small development projects in health, in education, and I believe that our 2 embassies in Kabul have already started a dialogue. They are looking at it, of course. The SDPs, the way they are structured, the ambassador, Indian ambassador has full authority to actually recommend the projects, but in our system, I guess it has to be referred back to Beijing. So, but I hope that we'll make some progress. Other area that we have seen, which is of clear importance, is something that China can also do, is to invest in sports. That is one factor we have seen that has united Afghan nation like anything. We did this in cricket very successfully, and now we know that the only threat, and I keep saying that the only threat to the regional countries is from Afghan cricket team, not the terrorists. The terrorists operate from some other geography. So that is something, and we have, I don't know if you met, there is a Bruce Lee, by the way, in Afghanistan. He is 100% replica of Bruce Lee. And martial sports and other things are something that China can actually look at promoting, but that will be a huge, it's a high impact, low maintenance sort of a project. And one thing, and this is to more get your reaction, while we can do joint projects together, but you will have to deal with a certain perception. And that perception is that given the China's size and its ability to spend and what it has been spending all around the world, that your spending and assistance in Afghanistan has been very small. And this is a perception which has been shared in Afghanistan, and which perhaps numbers would suggest that that is the right perception. You'll have to deal with that. And the second, that will China have an independent Afghan policy? Because Afghans feel that your policy is right now basically 100% aligned behind Pakistan's. And that is a major challenge of both perception and in certain tweaking of your policy, which would be required if you will have to become what Afghans would feel as a very nice and reliable partner. And of course, as he pointed out, both India and China are huge markets, the 2 biggest economies, and absolutely like we have done, perhaps a complete open access to Afghan products. They don't have much to export, and whatever they export, 60% India gets in any case, so the balance of the 40% you could get. So these are few things that we think that are steps that we could take. We could leave the major infrastructure for the later part, but with the smaller ones we could start quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amar, for one, reinforcing the case for trilateral or quadrilateral cooperation, of course, along with Afghanistan, and for suggesting number of specific areas where this cooperation can progress. As you said, we would like to hear comments from our Chinese friends, so we'll start with Ms. Li Qingyan. of CIS, which is the think tank affiliated to Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, Qingyan.
Thanks, Mr. Kantha and Mr. Barnett. Yeah. And thank you for all the India friends to join us on this important issue about about the international cooperation on Afghanistan. I think this state is very important neighbor countries, both for China and India. And first, I want to give some comment about the situation in Afghanistan. I really think that there is Afghanistan are facing a lot of challenges as insecurity, corruption, political turmoil, and unemployment as economic crisis. Yeah, but I should say the insecurity take the center stage. Although it has been made some progress, like realize of the first time ceasefire since the fail of Taliban regime. The intensified security situation like in Ghazi and Farah and the north part of Afghanistan cities. So I should say such kind of situation really worries about our immediate neighboring countries, including China and India. And it's really right time for us to put aside about some geopolitical conflicts or strategic competitions, just to let such kind of land to be a harbor of cooperation instead of the confrontation of many stakeholders, or you can say many joint powers. And I want to deliver some my views about the nowadays the international cooperation on this country. I classified about 4 categories, kinds of cooperation forms in this country since 2001. First, you can say maybe the most important one is under the framework of UN, and all of know UN have designed many peace road development projects or route map for this country. And the original one, or we can see the most important one, is the Bonn Agreement said about the future route of this country. And second is UN hold, I think, to hold a lot of international conferences to raise the money, the fundraising, to do the fundraising for this, to continue the Afghanistan government expenditures, all the feed of the armies, to keep this government to be normal operation. And the third is the security cooperation. The NATO, US-led NATO coalition arms have stayed there for almost 17 years. And I should say it is do a great support for the general stabilization of this country. And the third is such kind of international cooperation and the framework and the management of international financing institutions. I should the most important one is the reconstruction fund, trust fund managed by World Bank and accompanied with maybe Asia Development Bank and Islamic Development. Yeah, and think the most advantages of such kind of international financial institutions engaged in this issue is that it can really, to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in this country and really do some facilities for the civil projects to enhance the people's livelihood. And the third one I should say most maybe is become more and more important since the 2014 as the withdrawal of U.S. Troops from Afghanistan, that is the regional cooperation. I think maybe you can see Afghanistan is an active member of SAARC and ECO. Such I should say such kinds of organizations really give a very good platform for this in this country to join the connectivity and economic integration to follow the economic integration in this region. And the third one is about the energy cooperation, energy transfer. We know we have witnessed the Kantha 1000 and TAPI have made some progress in this region and help Afghanistan to eliminate its energy shortage in this country. And I think maybe in the future, as Ambassador suggestion that China and India maybe can do more efforts on this kind of energy transfer projects, and as well as in the in transportation fields, the newest progress made by the connect Afghanistan railway with central countries like Uzbekistan, and to continue, I should say, to continue extend its connection with Iran and even to the West Asia and Middle East, Middle East, and so lastly, I should say that is the bilateral cooperation, among the regional and even in larger field, the international communities. I know I should say India has to do a lot of contribution on the civilian projects to facilitate India's people's. And how about almost $3 billion maybe have been paid on this kind of projects. So on this field, China and India, I should say, have very common interests. And I think later in the future, maybe in maybe we should pay much more attention to how to do the make this cooperation be more efficient, and in the execution of this kind of projects, maybe we should have such kind of line about its national reconciliation. So when we want to maybe want to make such kind of domestic stream in this city, in this state, we should pay much attention on these fields. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Qingyan, for your comments and suggestions. Now I'll invite Lin Yiming. What I'll request, because of shortage of time, mainly stick to comments on the speakers already said.
Thank you, Ambassador Kant. I would like to give a quick response on mainly on China's policy. Just as Dr. Rubin mentioned that the Afghan policy of one state historically is determined by its relations with Afghanistan. It's always determined by a larger geopolitical picture. So it is easily to be perceived by the global audience and the global peoples on the China's Afghan policy. So partly because we know that Chinese media and the newspaper have a limited audience outside China. That is the problem. But the question is that I would like to give a quick summary on China's Afghan policy. That is that I believe that China's Afghan policy is a relatively simplified ends with a diversified means. What has meant because actually historically China does not have a lot of involvement in Afghan conflict historically. So the China's goals of China's Afghan policy is that is to have a political settlement or political solution to Afghan lasting conflicts. But as we know that China's attentions to Afghanistan is increasing in recent years, so China is trying to resort to a diversified platform and forum to have a leverage on this political solution to Afghan conflict. So, for example, the China-Afghan Pakistan cooperation mechanism is one of the maybe the major cooperation mechanism Chinese government resort to recently. So there's this apprehension that it's China's suppose that China-Pakistan economic corridors extension to Afghanistan. It is easily to be perceived by lots of the people that is China try to extend its influence into Afghanistan. No, actually it's just we call the policy instrument on China's Afghan policy to the solution to the Afghanistan political solution. That's the problem. And another thing is that I would like to mention that is China's another resort is to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now we have the SEO Afghan contact group, and we believe that I believe that SEO will play a bigger role in the future because we have India, we have Pakistan, and even Uzbekistan in this forum, and it will provide less, provide a platform with less national identities, and even under this forum we can have Afghan SEO Afghan US contact group or something like that, and it could be a more inclusive platform. And another potential areas we could cooperation together. One is just as I mentioned, is the anti-terrorism struggle. We know that there's a lot of what we call the foreign fighters from the Middle East, from the regions, from the areas outside the regions, and that will provide impose a common threat to the regional countries, including China, India, of course Pakistan, and even Uzbekistan and Central Asian republics. That is one potential areas of cooperation with maybe more consolidated consensus. And another way is agriculture, because if we have agriculture cooperation, that will provide a growth moment of Afghan economy. Also, is part of endeavor of anti-narcotic struggle. So I would like to stop here and give a floor back to.
Thank you, Yiming, for covering a number of good ideas on what can be done in partnership. Now the floor is open for comments and questions. Since time left is rather short, I'll request all of you to One, identify yourself. If possible, pose your question to one of the panelists. And keep your comment to question as brief as possible. Maybe Yogi will start with. Okay, General Mehta first, then I'll come to you.
Military first?
Okay, go ahead, military first. Yes. But General, I'll request very brief. Yeah.
Yeah, straight. Straight.
Yeah. I'll yield my mic to you.
Yeah, no, I think this is fine. Thank you very much for all the presentation. My first comment is on China. The gentleman Wang Shida. I was there in 2011 and we were interacting with your institute as the convener of an India-Afghanistan policy group. And the Chinese told us very clearly in 2011, although you did mention that the policy changed in 2014, that it was characterized by 4 no's. And the first no was no boots on the ground, no criticism of US, no use of the NDN, that is the Northern Distribution Network, and lastly, no interference in internal affairs of Afghanistan. So why has that changed? And my second comment is on this investment. I think somebody said that the Chinese have put very little money. And outside perception, I just come from Berlin yesterday after attending a conference on Afghanistan. And the public perception there is that the Chinese with deep pockets have invested heavily in Afghanistan, which is not true. My second observation and question is to Mr. Rubin.
This becomes third actually, but let me just go ahead.
I see you're dissecting question. My question is that the US, when Trump, उसमें अभी तक भारतीय ऑल इंडिया रेडियो ने कोई खबर नहीं दी है, लेकिन जब when Trump announced his Afghanistan policy, everybody thought that something was going to happen with the use of coercive force. And Jim Mattis, in fact, his famous last words were on Pakistan was that this is the last chance for Pakistan. I never forget that phrase. So what happened? What happened that the Americans behaved, or Trump behaved no differently from the other Americans?
Okay, then Ambassador Kumar, yes, then we'll just move there. We'll take 3-4 questions, then ask them to respond.
My name is Veni Prasad Agarwal. My question is, the crux of the matter is this ideological difference between the Taliban and the Afghan regime. And this is actually not just confined to Afghanistan. This ideological war is in the entire region. Is there a solution to that?
Thank you, Yogesh Kumar, and former ambassador. I have a comment in addition to what Ambassador Sinha has made. I think the problem for China, really in Afghanistan, would be that you will begin to realize the source of instability in Afghanistan, which is actually rooted in Pakistan. So that is a challenge that you're going to face, and as you address this issue, you will actually come into trying to understand as to why is Pakistan acting the way it is acting. That is a comment, but and surely it applies to CPEC and Pakistan and all that. My second point is that, you mentioned, you're very good that you mentioned about the the IS presence in Afghanistan and also in parts of Pakistan. Now, the point here is that what is the extent of cooperation that we can think of? US, India, Afghanistan, China, on this issue. To what extent we can do that is threat to all of them. But the problem here is the leakage of intelligence, which actually never takes place when Pakistan gets involved in these issues. And one last point I want to make on the BRI. You mentioned about the BRI possibility including Afghanistan, the BRI. Now, on what terms are you going to finance the projects there? Because many of these projects, I'm afraid, are actually economically unviable. And to what extent these projects, how the project will be financed, and whether they will actually create a very heavy debt burden on Afghanistan, which it will collapse under. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you that it is a very good talk from these three perspectives. Unfortunately, Afghanistan perspective lacks here, so that's the irony of Afghanistan. My question is that so far Afghanistan is seen as some kind of strategic value for these powers. As Professor Rubin summarized it very well, the evolution and devolution of Afghanistan's strategic power for these countries. And for this perspective, there have been some local that the approach has been that let's build consensus among the elites of Afghanistan. As Ambassador talked about the Bonn Conference, consensus building and all. But the problem here, I see that this is going to fail. I want to give credit to this consensus building. That it's for the short term it's a good solution, but for the long term it will fail because on the ground Afghanistan, all of them will not benefit from this kind of consensus building. Isn't there any approach that we can change? I mean, an alternative approach, something grassroots peace building approach by these countries. I mean, from this elite approach, yeah, we can bring Gulbuddin. We brought him, but his soldiers are fighting still. We may be able to bring some leaders of Taliban, but their Taliban will fight. Future Taliban will emerge. They are in madrasas of producing lots of students. Potentially, they can become. So, I mean, isn't there some kind of alternative, something grassroots approach? Thank you.
I think now we'll request our panelists to respond. We'll come back. We'll have one more round. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Chair, and also thanks for this question. I think several questions on Chinese, so that I'm going to give a quick feedback. First is that I think some gentlemen mentioned that China policy changed, why change, especially after 2014. I think reason is very simple. One reason is that after the withdrawal of the United States, it seems that the Afghanistan situation gets worse and worse. So that especially the ETI become existence in early 2015. That a really concrete threat, I think, security threat. The second issue is that it seems that in the past several years, regional countries, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, also include, I think, India, seems that to a lot of more expectation from China. So that is, I think, also an element. The third element, I think, that as a developing country, as the emerging countries, I think it is time to take some kind of responsibility. You see that as a country, you cannot just sit here and let the other do something. I think the responsibility become more and more important concern. I think from China's perspectives. Talk about China's investment, financial investment in Afghanistan. The government-to-government assistance, not too much, yes, I think is less than India. But you see that the China's, I think, at least the regional attention is to make a self-reliant Afghan economy through the heavy investment. The Anak copper mine, the CNPC, the project in Amdaria oil basin is a start. But unfortunately, at least the Anak copper mine did not go smoothly. Security issues are very important obstacles. But the good news is that the CNPC project in the northwest of Afghanistan is still working. Maybe we still can have some kind of hope for that. I think that is my response. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Just a few brief comments. First, General's question about Pakistan. I think that what the phenomena you observe indicates is that there are certain geographical and structural factors that determine the limits of American policy toward Pakistan. And that those are not subject to change by tweet. In particular, Afghanistan is landlocked. There are 3 routes from the outside to Afghanistan. One goes through Iran, one goes through Russia and Central Asia, and the other goes through Pakistan. That is a little bit lapis lazuli. If you want to do Marco Polo, you can go over the Wakhan corridor. But if you want to get an army into Afghanistan, or supply an army, you have to go through one of those 3 routes. For the United States, the only possible one is Pakistan at the moment, politically. That was a mistake. We can argue about why that is the case, but that is the case. Especially, we used the northern route in 2011 when Pakistan closed off the ground lines of control. But we can't do that now because we put sanctions on the railroads, the Russian railroads that we were using at that time. And we cannot put sanctions on all of our potential supply routes. I think they just found there is a practical limit. And in addition to that, you mentioned the use of coercion. The use of coercion, if you mean actual war or military activity against Pakistan, was never on the table by the United States.
Drone strikes.
Drone strikes happen, but drone strikes do not have any effect on the insurgency in Afghanistan. They kill some leaders of international terrorist organizations. Drone strikes are still going on, I believe, but they do not have a strategic effect in this kind of a war. And again, the image that many people in the United States and also in India and Afghanistan also had that somehow the United States could very easily force Pakistan to change its policy if it just tried harder. I personally believe, having been in the government and having tried harder, my conclusion is that it really cannot be done. Pakistan is embedded in other relationships, in particular with the relationship with China, but above all, its geographic location. And so there's some limits to what we can actually. Plus, it has nuclear weapons, so we have nuclear balance, deterrence in South Asia, which is very fragile, and we don't want to disturb it. Certainly not for a cause like this. Now, let me just say a few words. Actually, this is some things that Ambassador Mukhopadhaya said, other things people said. I want to just make it clear. The United States is not advocating or working for a political settlement with the Taliban because that is what it prefers to do, or because it thinks it's very easy, or it's enjoyable dealing with the Taliban, or we think that they will agree with our democratic ideas and it's just a misunderstanding. We're doing it because the military option has failed. Okay. So there is no other option at the moment. You can say, well, then you come back to, make Pakistan change its policy. Well, I've already discussed that. So a political settlement doesn't just mean with the Taliban. It also means with Pakistan and the other regional players. Personally, my impression is that the ideological element of the war, all the wars in Afghanistan, is overstated. And that people, and you can show that by the fact that so many groups have changed their ideologies and changed their allegiances from time when it became convenient to do so. So I think that fundamentally it's about the fact that they're dependent on external resources and therefore have to make links with outside powers, including sometimes terrorist organizations. I'm sorry, there's a question about grassroots peacemaking. Look, and this is related to Ambassador Mukhopadhya's argument about the ethnic balance since the Bonn agreement. Afghanistan, in its current format, look, I mentioned that it was set up to control the territory between the British and Russian empires. And what were the internal political arrangements? The internal political arrangements were British imperial support to a particular tribal dynasty of Pashtuns, not to all Pashtuns, but to a particular dynasty, to control the territory for the sake of security. As people became more mobilized in the war against the Soviet Union and through becoming refugees and so on, all the social changes that took place, So all the ethnic groups became mobilized. Bonn was partly a compromise on ethnic balance, but really they didn't agree on the ethnic balance in Bonn. They agreed on a process through which they would eventually reach agreement. And they still have not reached agreement. Okay? And that's why every presidential election turns into an argument about whether Afghanistan should have a prime minister or whether the administration should be decentralized. So this is quite, you know, the national identity of Afghanistan, the idea of how power should be exercised there is still in question. And a political settlement actually does not just mean with the Taliban. It means trying to agree on a set of processes through which, because it's not only the Taliban who want to change the Afghan constitution. Dr. Abdullah wants to change the Afghan constitution too. I bet you do also, from what you were saying.
Okay, Gautam, you go next.
Yeah, I'll take the question from the gentleman on the third row there. But before that, I also want to thank all the co-panelists for their very interesting and important contributions, and particularly the voice of China in this. And a couple of points that Ambassador Sinha said. One is, I think, highlighting or flagging, you know, the kind of aspirational changes that have taken place in Afghanistan, particularly among the youth and women, and also, you know, the possibility of a kind of east to west corridor around some of the major mineral sort of deposit areas. And I think that's actually a takeoff to your question. I think one of the most hopeful things that have happened in recent months has in fact been the Helmand Peace Initiative, which is a totally grassroots, peaceful movement that has come out from the heart of the Taliban territory in Helmand. And in some ways it's been directed both against the central government, but I think actually much more so towards the Taliban and their backers in Pakistan. I'm a little disappointed that that movement has not gathered the kind of momentum in spite of very heroic peace marches that have taken place. Secondly, there has been, you know, this whole enlightening movement, which at one stage came up, which was a mass mobilization in central Afghanistan for development, not for identity politics or anything like that. But once again, something that has somehow peaked and fizzled out, or not somehow captured the imagination or captured the interest of the political powers. And I think the point that I want to make here is that in some respects, patriarchy is very, very strongly entrenched and embedded in Afghanistan. The voice of the youth, even though President Ghani has tried to bring in the voice of the youth, including the ethnic youth from different parts of the country, into the government, in the traditional discussions on power, whether it's in the Loya Jirgas or in the constitutional process that took place, ultimately it is the senior figures from various political parties or tribes or groups that more or less decide. And the youth, the women have begun to speak up, but by and large the youth very rarely raise their voice. Now, I don't think, you know, Afghanistan has not dealt very kindly with reformers in a hurry in the past, and I don't think this is going to happen very immediately either. Obviously, it's a process, and I think this process that we are seeing, the demographic changes that have taken place, the aspirational attitudes that have changed, are part of a process that might one day, not too much in the future, because I think a lot of the people who have been educated abroad are coming back with many of these ideas. The demographic composition of the youth who are now much more in the urban centers, the desire for education among women and others is a very powerful motivation. But I'm still waiting for the day that this matures into a real political force. You're aware of the Afghanistan 1400 movement, another kind of urban youth, again, ultimately elite movement. Across the border, you have the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. Once again, a genuine movement for peace among the Pashtun people, again directed against the state security forces, particularly the Pakistani army. So there are people's movements there. The point is what can be done, and I don't think this is an area where the rest of the world should step in. This should remain a purely indigenous process. What is required to make this into a critical mass that can actually influence politics.
Okay, Amar.
Just one or two additional points. On the peace process, while Razik's killing, we have to remember that he is not just an ordinary SP. When we see a police chief, we think of an SP, DIG, etc. He was literally the governor or the chief minister, the border forces commander. No, he was running that state. The governor actually used to shadow him. An interesting thing I see, and there is a parallel, each time serious efforts are made towards peace. 2011 it was made. Rabbani was killed in his house. This time, 2 days after, the Americans go and meet Taliban, Mr. Razik is bumped off. And for India personally, I think it's a huge loss. Because if you remember, the last Kandahar is one, which is of course closest, is the heart of Taliban, but our consulate in Kandahar has never been attacked. And it all happened because of Razik. And the way he ran it. So I personally feel that we will have to be slightly more alert in Kandahar today. Otherwise, Herat, Mazar, all of them have been attacked, our mission itself. On CPEC into Afghanistan, and this is something I convey, a senior leader of Afghanistan told me when we had asked him, what does he think of CPEC? The way it is structured right now, he told me that, yes, it's a good football match, we are sitting outside and clapping. Now, whether they would actually become a player or not, we don't know. Of course, CPEC, BRI, etc., there are certain sensitivities in the region. China had a much easier option. They have already built the roads in Khargone.